legally. If the administration is willing to lie about who it's targeting under this law, what protections do totally innocent people have against abuse? Again, I want to ask you, will you advise the president to rescind his invocation of the wartime alien enemies
No, of course
act?
not. I mean, these are people that are threats to the national security.
This may look like a sharp exchange over a dusty statute, but it's actually a test of how modern power gets justified by stretching old legal tools to fit new fears. What's really being tested here is whether national security language can override constitutional restraint when the facts don't neatly match the law's original purpose. This raises broader questions about due process, accountability, and how emergency powers quietly become normal policy. In this video, we'll break down the legal logic, the rhetorical pivots, and what this moment reveals about who decides the limits of executive authority.
Gentlemen, do I understand that you're yielding to Senator Duckworth? Is that correct? Both of you? Senator Van Hollen? Are you going to yield to Senator Duckworth? Okay. Senator Duckworth.
I thank my colleagues. My daughter has dental surgery, so they're being very kind so I can get her through that. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, last March, the president invoked the Alien Enemies Act, a notorious wartime law last used for Japanese internment. He said that he was responding to the Maduro regime's supposed invasion or other acts of war against the United States. But in recent weeks, you, the Department of Justice, and our friends across the aisle have repeatedly said that we are not at war with Venezuela. Secretary Rubio, if that is true and we are not at war with Venezuela, will you advise the president to rescind his invocation of the Wartime Alien Enemies Act?
Well, that was a mechanism to remove people from our country that prevent grave danger. So, for example, we know for a fact that Trinidad was a very dangerous gang. In fact, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I may have been the first member of Congress.
This is a wartime act, Mr. Secretary.
Well,
are we currently at war with Venezuela?
No, we're not in a state of war in Venezuela.
Okay, the Supreme Court has described the Alien Enemies Act as a wartime power, our Supreme Court. And before now, the Alien Enemies Act was only invoked during the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, when it was used to intern thousands of innocent civilians. Are you really arguing that the president should be able to wield an internment law?
No, but we're talking about two separate things here. So you're talking about the state of Venezuela or are describing the regime.
And
we're talking about, but what the president designated.
Invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
I know, Senator, but let me be clear with you. No, but what the president was talking about are these gangs and these narco-trafficking groups that are waging war on the United States. There's no doubt. These groups have waged war on the United States. They have waged, for example, Trinidad was not just a criminal gang presence in our street. It is a criminal gang directly responsible for narco trafficking.
The Trump administration has acknowledged that the vast majority of the men it rounded up and deported to torture under this law had no criminal records whatsoever.
We didn't torture anybody.
Over 75%.
Who did we torture? We haven't tortured anybody. We've arrested people that are members of gangs and we've deported them. We don't want gang members in our country.
Have found that many of the men were here legally. If the administration is willing to lie about who it's targeting under this law, what protections do totally innocent people have against abuse? Again, I want to ask you, will you advise the president to rescind his invocation of the Wartime Alien Enemies Act?
No, of course not. I mean, these are people that are threats to the national security of the United States. But I've described this in hearings in the past, including
So you're saying that we're at war?
We are absolutely. When it comes to narco-trafficking groups and criminal gangs that are targeting the United States for criminal activity,
we're in a state of war.
There's no doubt about the fact that we're confronting them in a warlike setting because they're waging war
and do the Geneva Convention
They're waging war against us and they're enemy combatants as a result of it. And the fact of the matter is that we are confronting these irregular groups, and that's one of the great challenges of the new century in this hemisphere in particular, is that these non-state actors who possess state-like capabilities in terms of their weaponry pose a grave danger to the United States. I don't think any American would dispute that we have cartels that pose a threat to the national security of the United States.
With all of the other laws of when it comes to warfare. I mean, you're saying that he can invoke this wartime power.
No, I'm saying, you're asking me, I'm here to discuss foreign policy and what's in the realm of the Department of State.
Well,
I think your questions are better directed to the Department of Justice.
Enemies Act,
but I would tell you
that. Which is a wartime, which is something that the Supreme Court said can be invoked during wartime. It's only been invoked during the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. It's only been invoked 3 times, and this president is invoking it.
Okay, you're asking me a question about the domestic application of a law that's best directed to the Department of Justice.
No, it is
because you're asking me something to opine on something that's in the realm of the Department of Justice in terms of its domestic application. I can tell you that the United States is most certainly confronting terrorist and criminal organizations operating in our hemisphere that pose a grave danger to the United States. Anyone who believes that gangs that flood our country with fentanyl or cocaine are not threats to the United States is not living in reality and certainly does not reflect the opinion of most Americans.
The president already said that he was ready to put American troops in Venezuela again. So we're at war right now. So if things don't go well with the Chavistas you've empowered,
when did the president say he was going to put troops in Venezuela?
A military option, what is your criteria for returning to a military option and putting boots on?
Well, I don't recall the president saying he was going to put troops in Venezuela. Where did he say that?
I'm asking you, what are your...
But that's what you said. I didn't remember
the president has already said that he was ready to put American troops in Venezuela.
No, I think the president has said that he retains the right as commander-in-chief to protect the United States against any imminent threats. Maybe that involves troops, maybe that involves air power. We hope, but we don't anticipate that being the case in Venezuela.
I worry that you're playing fast and loose with our nation's
Well, I just gave
military.
you
And let me
testimony
just
here
say,
for
I just want to conclude by
Yeah,
saying,
but I just gave you testimony of how well things are moving forward, not as fast as
but
everybody
you
would like.
also said that
So
in 6 or 9 months, if things don't go well, you're going to have to do something else. And the president's already said that he's not ruled out the military option. And you've also just said that, yes, we are at war. The president has
But
wartime
every
powers.
president retains
So
the power to
it's
use military to
reasonable for me
protect-
to ask you,
And I gave you a very specific example. Every president retains the right to defend the United States against an imminent threat. Yes, if there are just give you an example, Iranian drones deployed in Venezuela that could threaten the United States, we most certainly will address that, even if it's located in Venezuela. But we hope we don't get to that point. We don't expect to get to that point.
I don't think that
we're not trending in that direction. That's a fact. But that said, on the
the
one
people
hand,
of America
people
are
here
worried that
unhappy
this
we're
is a president
cooperating
who
with
engages
Venezuela.
in yet
On the other hand,
another
they want us to
forever
go to
war,
with
Mr.
them.
Secretary.
What's
We don't
that?
need to be in another forever war. And that is the path that we are going towards. And let me just say...
Well, how are we
let me
going toward the
conclude- let me
forever
just- let
war
me
if we're
just
dealing with
conclude.
we're
Well,
dealing
you're
with
not
Delcy
ruling out a
Rodriguez every
military
day?
option. You're not going to ask him to rescind his invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. That puts Americans in jeopardy. And let me just say something about the
Senator-
president's recent comments about NATO allies. When I served in Iraq, there were Polish forces there with us. There were British forces there with us. There were Spanish forces there with us. I personally landed in Elzi, España, which came under direct attack by insurgents. Polish troops who worked with the Illinois military, with the Illinois National Guard for 30 years, died in Afghanistan, Mr. Secretary.
All the president
so I just
wants
want
is
to
for
say
NATO to
is
have
that
more
our NATO
capabilities.
allies have stood beside
wants
us,
our allies to
and
have more
we
na-
need to maintain the strength of that alliance.
I get it.
yield.
All
Senator,
the
your
president wants is our
time's
allies.
up. Not making much progress here.
Well, let me just
very
say, the
much.
president
Let's-
just wants our allies to have more capabilities to be involved in operations like that, God forbid, in the future if necessary.
That's not what
an
he said.
unreasonable
He said
request.
That they stayed a little behind, and they certainly did not come to our defense. And
Well, not
they
every
did.
country in Europe, not every country in NATO participated in those missions. Some did.
Denmark suffered some of the greatest military casualties.
There's no doubt that many of our allies have stepped forward and provided assistance to us, and there are many others that simply don't have the capability to do it now or in the future.
That's not what the president said.
So that's
Senator
what he
Lee,
was pointing to.
What you just watched was more than a clash between two lawmakers and a cabinet official. It was a collision between the language of war and the rules of a constitutional republic. In that exchange, Senator Tammy Duckworth pressed Secretary Marco Rubio on a stark question. If the United States is not at war with Venezuela, then why invoke a wartime statute, the Alien Enemies Act, a law historically tied to the darkest chapters of mass detention and sweeping government power? And Rubio, under the hot lights of oversight, did what Washington often does when it's cornered. He reframed the battlefield. Duckworth came in with precision and urgency. She didn't just ask about policy, she asked about precedent, about the Supreme Court's own description of the act as a wartime power, about the terrifying elasticity of a government tool designed for war being stretched into ordinary life. Her argument was simple and devastating. If we are not at war, then stop speaking and acting like we are. Don't let a nation drift into emergency powers because it's politically convenient. Don't normalize the extraordinary. Rubio's response wasn't simply an answer, it was a worldview. He rejected the premise that war is only a formal declaration against a state. Instead, he painted the threat as irregular, shadowy, and constant, a warlike reality that justifies warlike authority. Listen closely to the hinge point in his logic. He conceded there is no state of war with Venezuela, then pivoted to insist the nation is confronting non-state actors with state-like capabilities. In other words, the enemy is everywhere. The conflict has no clean borders, and the timeline is undefined. That is how permanent emergency is born. Not with a single dramatic announcement, but through a steady change in vocabulary. Wartime power, enemy combatants, grave danger, national security. These words do more than describe. They reshape the boundaries of what citizens are asked to accept. And when those boundaries move, they rarely move back. Duckworth pushed the pressure point again and again. If the administration can blur the line between targeted enforcement and sweeping authority, what protections exist for innocent people caught in the machinery? She wasn't speaking in abstractions. She was warning about the human cost of a system that can label first and verify later. And Rubio, rather than engage the constitutional fear at the heart of her question, tried to redirect the responsibility. Not my department, talk to justice, I'm here for foreign policy. That deflection tells you something too. Because when power expands, accountability often scatters. The authority is centralized, but the blame is distributed. And then the exchange widened into something even bigger. Duckworth raised the specter of forever war, the kind of open-ended conflict that becomes a background hum in national life, always present, always justified, always draining the public's attention and moral clarity. Rubio pushed back, insisting the United States is not trending toward direct military action in Venezuela, and emphasizing that any president retains the right to respond to imminent threats. In other words, calm words, steady tone, and a reassurance that the option remains on the table. That contradiction is a familiar American story. We say we don't want endless conflict, but we keep the logic that produces it. We insist we are stepping away from escalation while leaving every door unlocked. And history shows what happens when leaders frame security as limitless. The public gets told to trade due process for protection, nuance for speed, restraint for strength. The law becomes a lever, and fear becomes the hand pulling it. Duckworth didn't just argue from theory, she spoke from experience, reminding the room of allies who stood alongside the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, Poles, British, Spanish, the reality of coalition sacrifice, and the fragile truth that alliances are not mere talking points. Her warning about NATO wasn't nostalgia. It was a reminder that credibility is not something you can demand. It's something you build, day after day, with consistent principles. And Rubio, to his credit, acknowledged that many allies have stepped forward, then slipped into the transactional language that dominates modern politics. Capabilities, burden, participation. It's the language of metrics and commitments, not shared values. And that too connects back to the central theme of the hearing. What happens when government treats people and principles as instruments? Because in the end, the real fight here isn't Duckworth versus Rubio. It's the United States arguing with itself about the meaning of power, about whether national security is a narrow duty or an all-purpose justification, about whether wartime tools stay in wartime or become a permanent feature of governance in a fearful age. A republic is supposed to be strongest when it is most restrained, when it can confront danger without surrendering the standards that make it worth defending. Tonight's moment matters because it exposes the uncomfortable truth at the center of modern leadership. In Washington, almost everyone claims to fear overreach, but far fewer are willing to give up the tools that enable it. The temptation is always the same. If power can be used for the right reasons, then surely it should be easier to use. But law doesn't exist for the easy days. It exists for the hardest days. When pressure rises, when accusations fly, when certainty is scarce, and when the government's hand moves quickly. So the question lingers long after the microphones cool. If we are not at war, why are we reaching for wartime authority? And if we keep redefining war to fit whatever threat we face, what is left of the limits that protect ordinary people from extraordinary power? A nation that forgets the difference between enforcement and emergency will eventually live in a permanent emergency. And a government that can declare war-like conditions whenever it chooses can justify almost anything. If you want more clear-eyed coverage of the moments that shape America's future, the clashes, the contradictions, and the consequences, subscribe to Liberty Report USA. Support our work to expose the truth,